The Nona-S self-propelled mortar may be the least bad platform in the BMD family, dare I say, the best. The 2S9 was introduced by the Soviets in 1981 to provide regimental and divisional fire support to its airborne divisions, and today lives on in post-Soviet militaries that were hosts to airborne forces, Russia and Ukraine being the most famous users. This video covers this vanguard of the modern turreted mortar, with a heavy focus on how its units are structured and where they fit into the Russian, Ukrainian, and Soviet military hierarchies. It'll also cover the Nona-S development history and preceding projects. Apparently the Soviets got some ideas from the French. By the way, a shout out to my buddies at Safar Publishing for letting me use some of their uniform references for this video. Check out their new and upcoming books on VDV uniforms in Afghanistan and Europe at the link in the pinned comment. The 2S9 Nona-S is a Soviet-designed airborne self-propelled gun mortar. It's based on the BTR-D, an armored personnel carrier version of the BMD-1 infantry fighting vehicle that serves as the base for most of the support variants of the BMD. It's longer, with 6 road wheels instead of 5. It carries a 4-man crew: the commander, gunner, loader, and driver mechanic. The 2S9's purpose is to provide indirect and direct fire support to airborne formations, using the 120mm 2A51 breech-loaded gun mortar. The Nona-S can traverse 35 degrees in either direction and elevate up to 80 degrees, allowing for a short minimum range and a near vertical trajectory on its shells. It can fire a variety of rifle and fin-stabilized shells in the typical flavors, plus heat and newer Russian thermobaric, cluster, and guided options. The 30F49HE frag shell, to give an example of a workhorse round, has a minimum range of 100 meters and a max range of 8.8 kilometers, extended to 12.8 kilometers with rocket assistance. Soviet shells designed for older smoothbore systems like the PM43 get slightly less range out of the Nona-S, at about 7 kilometers, on par with the dismounted 2B11. In terms of performance, it's basically a more capable mortar, but with comparable explosive filler per shell to their 122mm howitzers and anti-armor capability at self-defense ranges. Its maximum range is inferior to 122mm howitzers, but its lower minimum range allows them to get in closer. The original production variant of the 2S9 only carried 25 rounds, which was noted as something to be improved at the time of its adoption. The later 2S9-1 of the mid to late 1980s upped this to 40 rounds, although due to weight restrictions it can only drop with 25 rounds aboard. The airborne curse rears its ugly head. With the technicals out of the way, let's get into the history and unit organization. First, we'll start with the development history of the Nona-S gun and then hit the organization during the Cold War. That's right, it's a Hyperwar 1989 video. Haven't seen that title card in a while, huh?
We're back, baby!
The first step of the Nona-S development was an unrelated project that sought to combine aspects of mortars and recoilless rifles into a sort of universal gun. In form, the Soviets were particularly inspired by France's long-standing 120mm rifled mortar. Unlike most mortars which are smooth-bore, the French 120 is rifled, and its shells have rifling bands cut into the projectiles themselves instead of a copper driving band as is common in other forms of artillery. This allowed for lower barrel pressure and thus thinner shell walls, which when combined with a longer, more projectile-shaped shell with greater volume meant more explosive filler for their shell size. It also allowed for more uniform shell wall thickness and thus more uniform fragmentation. Soviet intelligence managed to procure some French shells for testing, and these helped inform the Nona-S future armament. Initially though, the concept was used for a different project, the Lily 120mm mountain gun, which was a towed weapon combining aspects of a mortar and recoilless rifle. It could be operated in 2 ways depending on the configuration: as a breech-loading recoilless rifle with jet nozzles at its base, or as a muzzle-loading mortar. As a result of testing at the Tbilisi Artillery School in Georgia though, it was found that combining the functions of a recoilless rifle and mortar did not really make sense, and in any case, ATGMs were the new hotness for dedicated anti-tank work. The next step on the path to the Nona was the shift to a mortar-first breech-loading design in 1973, following the lineage of Soviet 160mm smoothbore breech-loading mortars. This was about when the airborne forces came in. Their attempts at introducing a self-propelled 122mm howitzer based on the BMD-1 called the 2S2 Fialka, as well as a more conventional 120mm mortar carrier called the Landish, had failed. They also tested parachuting the 2S1 used by motor rifle and tank units, which was possible but probably not the most elegant solution. The VDV made their next go at it contingent on a 1-year turnaround time, favoring a platform with some development time already behind it. The new airborne gun mortar project gained the name Nona. The new gun was first fit on a casemate version of the BTRD in 1974 and designated the Nona-D. Although, for safety reasons, it was initially tested with smoothbore projectiles with crew outside the vehicle, while the new rifled rounds were tested on a towed platform. Just as well, one of the Nona-D's tests resulted in the propellant exploding in the breech. But this ultimately went smooth enough for a proof of concept. In December of 1976, it was ordered that the development of a self-propelled gun for the Airborne and its accompanying ammunition go forward. Of the 4 layouts developed in 1975, the one that would become the Nona-S was developed by engineer V.V. Artyuk, and the first test prototype rolled off the production line in mid-1977. After modification, this prototype was assigned the index 2S9, while the gun became 2A51. Later, the same gun would be applied to the towed 2B16 Nona-K, briefly called the Nona-B. While the Nona-K was primarily used by the regiments of the 45th Guards Motor Rifle Division in the Leningrad region, the Nona-S had much wider fielding. The first pre-production batch of 6 2S9s were delivered in 1979 for testing by an experimental battery at the Erzhevka range. This battery was staffed by personnel from the 104th Airborne Regiment. As a result of these trials, the Nona-S was accepted into service in 1981. Its accompanying command vehicle, the 1V-119 Rheostat, followed shortly after in 1982. From then on, the Nona-S would start being integrated at 2 levels. First, the Soviet Airborne Regiment's battery of 6 120mm mortars carried Porty style by GAZ-66Bs was replaced by a whole self-propelled artillery battalion with 18 2S9s. As well, in 1982, a 2S9 battalion replaced the 85mm D-44 gun battalion in the Airborne Artillery Regiment. By October of 1981, the Soviets put together a battery of 2S9s for deployment to Afghanistan. This would be the 3rd battery of the 345th Separate Parachute Regiment's Artillery Battalion, trained by 2 officers from the 104th Regiment. The 103rd Guards Airborne Division, which had been in Afghanistan since 1979, also reorganized its 85mm gun battalion into a 2S9 battalion, and its regimental 120mm mortar batteries into 2S9 batteries. In the ground forces, the 56th Separate Air Assault Brigade also replaced its battalion-level 120mm mortar batteries with a 2S9 battery per infantry battalion. This would later be generalized for the new air assault battalions within the 2nd Wave Air Assault Brigades, although not in the foot-mobile parachute battalions. Despite the naming, the roles were really reversed. The armored units were for parachuting, and the foot-mobile were for helicopter assaults. The Nona-S was internally loadable into an Mi-26, but it wasn't practical for battalion-level fire support within helicopter assault units to be contingent on those being available. In Naval Infantry Brigades, 1 2S9 battery was also added to each separate Naval Infantry Battalion. In addition to being airborne, the Nona-S is also amphibious. By August of 1987, 69 2S9s accounted for about a quarter of the 269 self-propelled artillery pieces in Afghanistan. In the mountainous terrain, the Nona-S was advantageous due to its high firing elevation and short minimum range compared to other SPGs. This allowed for effective shelling of reverse slopes and countering close ambushes on steep mountain roads. Perhaps that's why after they put a derivative of the Nona-S's gun, the 2A60, on a BTR-80 and called it the 2S23 Nona-SVK, one of its primary users has been the 55th Separate Guards Mountain Motor Rifle Brigade. Post-Cold War, other than the uses you expect in Chechnya and Ukraine, one specific use of the Nona-S was in peacekeeping units in the 90s. In 1995, Russia formed a first separate airborne brigade from elements of the 76th and 98th Guards Airborne Divisions as its contribution to the NATO-led stabilization force in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The brigade consisted of a brigade HQ, 2 separate parachute battalions, and brigade troops. Each of those parachute battalions had a 4-gun 2S9 battery with 2 1V-119 command vehicles for close support, although this brigade was later reduced to the 22nd Separate Airborne Regiment. Now that you know how the Nona-S fits in overall, let's talk about the battery organization. But first, shout out to the 1st Siege Artillery Group, one of 4 battle order task forces filled with my supporters who keep these videos coming, and the only artillery-themed one. Join up at the links in my description. At the base was the gun crew. The commander was ideally a sergeant, and everyone was authorized the AKS-74U carbine. 3 guns made a firing platoon under a senior lieutenant platoon commander. There were 2 firing platoons per battery. The 2nd platoon in particular held the battery's resupply section, which was under a junior sergeant and included 3 GAZ-66 2-ton 4x4 trucks. In the late 80s, one of the trucks carried an RPG-7D rocket-propelled grenade launcher, or an RPG-16 in the early 80s. At the battery level, there was a battery HQ and a control platoon. Battery HQ was just people. During peacetime, it had the battery commander, deputy commander and airborne training instructor, battery sergeant major ranking senior praporshchik or warrant officer, and a senior technician ranking praporshchik. During wartime, they'd also include a deputy commander for political affairs and a medical NCO. The control platoon, meanwhile, had the vehicles to form the battery's forward observation and command posts. The control platoon consisted of the platoon commander and 2 1V-119 rheostat artillery command and control vehicles. The first was the battery commander's recon section and was crewed by the deputy platoon commander, who was also a surveyor operator, a scout rangefinder, 2 radio operators, and a driver mechanic. In combat, the battery commander and control platoon commander rode in this vehicle. They would co-locate with their supported maneuver battalion to coordinate fire support. The other vehicle was the senior battery officer's communications section, with a section leader doubling as a surveyor operator, radio operator, fire computer, and driver mechanic. Both firing platoon commanders rode in this vehicle, the first being the senior battery officer. They'd be located with the guns to run the battery itself. For the most part, airborne SPG battalions had 3 of these firing batteries, for a total of 18 tubes per battalion. The regimental version in particular had a battalion HQ and control platoon with 2 more rheostat control vehicles, and a support platoon with a BTRD APC and MRS DAT mobile repair shop based on the GAZ-66 for maintenance, plus 2 GAZ-66s and a PAC-200 truck-mounted field kitchen. Of note, the Battalion Chief of Intelligence or S2 equivalent was a senior lieutenant and also the commander of the control platoon. Now, as for the modern day, the batteries are pretty similar. As per 2016 Doctrine, batteries still included 6 guns split into 2 firing platoons, with the 1st platoon commander as the senior battery officer. The ammo resupply section is the same composition, but instead of the GAZ-66, the ideal nowadays, at least by the textbook, are 3 Kamaz 5350 6x6 trucks. I assume this would be interchangeable with the ubiquitous Ural 4320. Likewise, the battery HQ is largely the same, but just 1 deputy commander instead of 2. This made for a 43-man battery. The big difference is that in the mid-2000s, Russia issued a modernization for the Nona-S, called the 2S9-1M. These included automation to the fire control system and an inertial reference system, which significantly cut down the turnaround time for unplanned fire missions from up to 7 minutes to less than a minute. As for the Ukrainian side of the house, after the split up of the Soviet Union, only 1 unit within Ukraine's new air mobile forces retained armored airborne capabilities, the 25th Separate Airborne Brigade. As late as 2015 in the doctrine they used to teach military students, each airborne battalion was meant to have its own 2S9 battery. This battery was very similar to the Cold War version, with an identical battery HQ, just swap out the political officer for deputy commander and educational work, 2 platoons of 3 Nonas each, 2 command vehicles, and 3 GAZ-66 trucks in 2nd platoon. There were 3 big differences though. First, the senior battery officer's command vehicle was listed directly under the 1st platoon instead of the control platoon. Second, the Nonas were authorized 5 crew members each, with a 2nd loader. I imagine this was advantageous in the firing position since rounds could be passed from the outside of the vehicle via a slide and hatch on the rear under the turret. And the 3rd difference, instead of everyone getting AKS-74Us, they were authorized AKS-74s. That's the full-length rifle with a folding stock, and the 6 officers in the battery got PM pistols. However, basically immediately after 2014, the 25th Airborne Brigade came to be based on only one battalion with BMDs and 2 other battalions with other vehicles, by 2018 on BMP-2s. By that point, the organization looked more like 9 Nona-S in the BMD-equipped battalion, but notably no 1V119s. My source doesn't include the internal organization, but it could be a battery or perhaps dispersed platoons. There was also an 18-gun battalion of Nona-S under the brigade's artillery regiment for a total of 27 in the baseline brigade. You can check out my video on how Ukrainian airborne brigades evolved after the fall of the Soviet Union to learn more.